Gabriel Stone stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in his penthouse, the weight of a $4,000 tuxedo hanging heavy on his shoulders. He adjusted the silk bow tie, staring at the man the world expected him to be, the cold, distant architect of Stone Global. Outside, the Manhattan skyline glittered, a kingdom built on his father's sweat and his own ruthless precision. But lately, the ivory tower felt hollow. The reports crossing his desk spoke of record profits, yet the anonymous tips flooding his secure inbox told a darker story of fear, exhaustion, and a CEO who saw people as mere line items. With a sharp, decisive movement, Gabriel began to strip away the armor of his status. The tuxedo was tossed onto the bed like a discarded skin. In its place, he reached for a pair of stiff, navy blue coveralls. As he pulled them on, the fabric felt coarse against his skin, a stark reminder of the invisible thousands who kept his gears turning. He zipped the front, the metallic rasp echoing in the silent room. Gabriel Stone was gone. In the reflection stood a man whose name tag simply read Gabe. "You're sure about this, Gabriel?" Marcus Holloway's voice came from the doorway. The internal auditor stood with his arms crossed, a thin file tucked under his arm. "Harrison Forde isn't just aggressive. He's toxic. If he catches the owner of the company scrubbing floors, he won't just be embarrassed, he'll be dangerous." Gabriel didn't turn around. He was busy smudging a bit of grease onto his forearm, perfecting the disguise. "That's exactly why I'm doing it, Marcus. Harrison has turned this company into a machine that eats its own. If I walk into those offices as Gabriel Stone, I'll see a choreographed play where everyone is happy and efficient. But if I walk in as the man who empties their trash, I'll see the truth." Marcus stepped further into the room, his expression a mix of concern and grim curiosity. "He thinks he's untouchable because of the merger. He thinks you're too busy on your yacht to notice he's gutting the culture." "Let him think that," Gabriel said, finally turning to face his oldest friend. His eyes, once weary, were now sharp with a predatory focus. "A man only shows his true face to those he deems beneath him. I need to know if the company my father built still has a soul, or if it's just a house of cards waiting for the wind to change." He picked up a battered cap and pulled it low over his brow. "Keep your eyes on the books, Marcus. I'll be on the ground. Let's see how Harrison Forde treats the lazy ones when he thinks no one important is watching." The transition from the penthouse to the service corridors of Stone Global felt like stepping into a different dimension. Gabriel moved through the side entrance, the weight of a heavy industrial mop bucket replacing the leather briefcase he usually carried. The air here was different, thick with the scent of floor wax and the hum of massive ventilation fans. As he emerged into the sleek, marble-floored lobby, he braced himself for recognition, but it never came. He was no longer the sun around which the company orbited, he was merely a ghost in blue coveralls. He spent the morning buffing the floors of the executive wing, a task that required him to work around the feet of people he had known for years. His chief financial officer stood 3 feet away, discussing quarterly projections with a junior analyst, their eyes sliding right over Gabriel as if he were a piece of office furniture. It was a jarring, cold realization. To these people, the uniform didn't just indicate a job, it rendered the human inside it transparent. The atmosphere shifted when the elevator chimed, announcing the arrival of Harrison Forde. The energy in the hallway tightened instantly, a palpable wave of anxiety following the CEO as he strode toward the boardroom. Forde was a vision of curated power, his suit sharp enough to draw blood, his eyes fixed on the tablet in his hand. Gabriel slowed his pace, positioned near a set of glass doors, waiting to see if a year of board meetings would trigger even a flicker of familiarity in Forde's eyes. As the CEO approached, a young intern accidentally stepped into his path, nearly colliding with him. Forde didn't stop or offer a word, he simply sidestepped the boy with a look of profound annoyance, as if he had encountered a minor glitch in a software program. Then, Forde was inches away from Gabriel. The CEO's polished Oxford shoes clicked rhythmically against the marble Gabriel had just spent an hour polishing. Gabriel stood still, mop in hand, looking directly at the man he had hired to lead his legacy. For a heartbeat, their eyes almost met. Gabriel held his breath, expecting the mask to slip, expecting the checkmate moment to happen far too early. But Forde's gaze didn't linger. It didn't even land. He looked through Gabriel, his mind already occupied by the multi-billion-dollar merger, seeing only a blurred obstacle in a blue uniform that needed to stay out of his way. He passed so closely that the scent of his expensive cologne momentarily masked the smell of bleach. Forde continued down the hall, barking an order into his headset about trimming the fat in the maintenance budget. Gabriel watched him go, his grip tightening on the wooden handle of the mop. He had wanted to see the truth of his company, and now he had it. To Harrison Forde, the people who built, cleaned, and maintained Stone Global weren't just lazy, they were invisible. Gabriel shifted his focus to the bowels of the building, descending into the humid, industrial thrum of the basement mechanical rooms. Here, the air was heavy with the smell of scorched oil and the rhythmic, labored pounding of the primary boiler system. Gabriel's father had always insisted that the heart of the company wasn't in the penthouse, but in the infrastructure that kept the lights on and the workers safe. As he knelt before the main steam assembly, Gabriel saw a sight that made his blood run cold. The primary safety relief valve, a critical component designed to prevent a catastrophic pressure buildup, was weeping a steady stream of scalding water. Even worse, a heavy steel clamp had been crudely bolted over the mechanism, forcing the valve shut. It was a quick fix, a lethal shortcut meant to bypass the alarm system rather than address the underlying failure. Gabriel reached out, his gloved fingers tracing the jagged edge of the clamp, and noticed a bright yellow maintenance tag dangling nearby. He pulled the tag closer. The ink was fresh, dated only 2 weeks prior. It was a formal request for a full system overhaul, signed by the head of engineering. Across the bottom, slashed in the aggressive, unmistakable handwriting of Harrison Forde, was a single word in red, denied. Beneath it, a brief note explained the reasoning. Cost exceeds quarterly maintenance ceiling. Implement temporary bypass until after merger. Gabriel felt a surge of cold fury that eclipsed his previous indignation. This wasn't just a lack of respect, it was a reckless disregard for human life. If this valve failed to vent during a peak load, the resulting explosion would tear through the first 3 floors of the building, turning the marble lobby into a graveyard. Forde was willing to gamble the lives of hundreds of employees just to keep the operational expenses low enough to impress the merger partners. A heavy footstep echoed on the concrete behind him. Gabriel didn't move, keeping his head down as he adjusted his wrench. A junior supervisor, looking harried and pale, stopped beside him. "Don't bother with that, Gabe," the man muttered, his voice devoid of hope. "The front office says it's fine. We told them it's a ticking bomb, but Forde said if we couldn't make the current budget work, he'd find a crew that could." Gabriel remained silent, but his grip on the wrench tightened until his knuckles turned white. He looked at the bypass clamp again, seeing it for what it truly was, the physical manifestation of Harrison Forde's leadership. The company didn't just have a toxic culture, it had a fatal one. He realized then that his audit was no longer about hurt feelings or corporate dignity. He was now in a race against time to stop a disaster that Forde had deliberately set in motion. He needed to find Marcus. The game had just become a matter of life and death. Gabriel emerged from the steam-choked darkness of the basement, his mind racing with the technical data of a disaster in waiting. As he stepped back into the glass and steel perfection of the main atrium, the contrast was sickening. Upstairs, the air was chilled to a precise 70 degrees, smelling of lilies and expensive stationery, while below, men and women worked in the shadow of a tethered explosion. Gabriel found himself positioned near the grand mahogany staircase just as Harrison Forde emerged from a side gallery, flanked by a phalanx of nervous middle managers. Forde was in rare form, his voice projecting a coached confidence that filled the cavernous space. He stopped abruptly, his eyes landing on Gabriel, who was currently kneeling to scrub a scuff mark near the base of a marble pillar. The CEO's face contorted into a mask of theatrical disgust. "Look at this," Forde announced to his entourage, gesturing vaguely at Gabriel's hunched form. "The lack of urgency is staggering. This is why our margins are bleeding. We have workers who treat a world-class facility like a Sunday park bench." Gabriel didn't look up, but he felt the heat of Forde's polished shoe nudge his bucket, sloshing gray water onto the pristine floor. "Hey, Gabe, is it?" Forde sneered, reading the name tag with a condescending tilt of his head. "Try moving that mop like your paycheck depends on it." Because after the merger, people who move at this speed won't even be allowed in the parking lot. A few of the managers let out forced, sycophantic chuckles, their eyes darting away in shame. But one man remained perfectly still. Marcus Holloway stood at the edge of the circle, a leather-bound audit folder tucked under his arm. To anyone else, Marcus looked like the dutiful corporate soldier, professional, silent, and compliant. But as Gabriel finally raised his head to meet the verbal assault, his eyes locked with Marcus's. In that brief, silent exchange, the power dynamic of the entire building inverted. Marcus didn't flinch or look away. Instead, a faint, razor-sharp smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. It was a look of pure, clinical anticipation, the look of a man watching a predator walk blindly into a steel trap. Marcus gave a nearly imperceptible nod, a signal that the financial evidence was gathered, the trap was set, and the janitor was now authorized to finish the audit. Forde, oblivious to the silent execution happening behind his back, let out one last dismissive huff. "Clean it up, Gabe. All of it. I want this floor so bright I can see my own success in it." As the group moved on, Forde's laughter echoed through the lobby. Gabriel remained on his knees, his eyes following the CEO's back. He wasn't thinking about the insults anymore. He was thinking about the bypass clamp in the basement, and how very soon, Harrison Forde was going to learn exactly who owned the air he breathed. The Grand Meridian Ballroom was transformed into a cathedral of glass and gold, a shimmering testament to the impending merger that Harrison Forde believed would be his crowning achievement. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, forgiving light over 500 of the city's most powerful figures, their diamonds catching the glow like scattered stars. At the center of the room, a raised stage held a single mahogany desk where the merger documents awaited a signature that would officially consolidate Stone Global into a sprawling, faceless conglomerate. Harrison Forde stood at the edge of the stage, the master of all he surveyed. He adjusted his silk lapels, his face illuminated by a spotlight that seemed to follow his every move. To the investors and socialites, he was the visionary who had trimmed the fat and optimized a legacy into a high-yield machine. He moved through the crowd with practiced grace, shaking hands with a firm, paternalistic grip, his laughter booming over the soft swell of the orchestra. Every word he spoke was a performance of absolute certainty. He regaled a group of venture capitalists with stories of his decisive leadership, mocking the old-school sentimentality of the company's founder. "Success isn't about looking back," he declared, his voice carrying to the waitstaff standing at attention. "It's about knowing which parts of the machine are worth keeping and which are just taking up space." Gabriel moved through the periphery of the opulence, a shadow in blue denim amid a sea of black ties. He pushed a brass-fitted cleaning cart along the red-carpeted edges of the room, his eyes fixed on the floor he had spent the afternoon preparing. He was invisible once more, a ghost haunting his own party. He saw the way the servers flinched when Forde walked past, the way the young associates checked their phones with trembling hands. The atmosphere wasn't one of celebration, but of a hostage crisis draped in velvet. From his vantage point near the bar, Marcus Holloway watched the CEO's ascent toward the stage. Marcus held a glass of mineral water, his expression an inscrutable mask of professional detachment. When Gabriel passed him, Marcus didn't speak, but he tightened his grip on the leather folder in his hand, the folder that contained the engineering reports and the paper trail of Forde's dangerous bypass in the basement. Forde finally ascended the stairs to the mahogany desk, basking in a thunderous, choreographed ovation. He picked up the fountain pen, holding it aloft like a scepter. "Tonight," he announced into the microphone, his grin widening with a shark-like intensity, "we stop pretending that a company is a family. Tonight, we prove that Stone Global is a weapon." Gabriel stopped his cart, standing perfectly still in the shadows. He looked at the stage, then at the ticking clock on the wall. The merger was moments away, the pressure in the basement was peaking, and Harrison Forde had never felt more like a god. Gabriel shifted his weight, his legs aching from 10 hours of haunting the corridors and basements of his own empire. The opulence of the ballroom felt like a fever dream, a gilded mask stretched over a dying heart. Just 10 feet from the stage, tucked behind a heavy velvet curtain, stood a single, nondescript folding chair. Gabriel sat. It was a 5-minute window to check the pressure sensor readout on his handheld device, a hidden tool to monitor the ticking bomb in the basement, but to anyone watching, it looked like a janitor finally succumbing to the weight of his mop. He leaned his head back against the cold stone pillar, his eyes closing for a fleeting second. The sounds of the gala, the tinkling of crystal, the scripted laughter, the hollow promises of the merger felt miles away. He was a man pausing to breathe before the storm. "Are you comfortable, Gabe?" The voice was like a splash of ice water. Gabriel opened his eyes to find Harrison Forde standing over him, his shadow stretching long and dark across the floor. The CEO had stepped off the stage, fountain pen still in hand, his face twisted into a mask of pure, performative malice. The crowd, sensing a spectacle, began to drift toward them, their conversations dying out as they circled like wolves around a fallen deer. "I asked you a question," Forde snapped, his voice projecting to the back of the room. "Is the marble too hard for you? Do you need a pillow and a glass of champagne to go with that paycheck you're stealing from me?" Gabriel remained seated, his gaze level and unblinking. "I was taking 5 minutes, Mr. Forde. The floors are finished." 5 minutes? Forde let out a sharp, jagged laugh, looking around at the socialites for approval. "The ink isn't even dry on the biggest merger in this city's history, and you're sitting here like you own the place." He stepped closer, the smell of expensive scotch and unearned confidence radiating off him. He kicked the leg of Gabriel's chair, the metal rattling against the floor. "This is exactly what's wrong with the old Stone Global. Too much dead weight. Too many Gabes thinking they're entitled to a rest while I'm up there building a future." Forde turned to the nearest camera, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the kill. "Let this be a lesson to everyone here tonight about the new standard of excellence." He turned back to Gabriel, his voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. "You're done. Don't bother returning the uniform, you've probably stained it with your laziness anyway. You're fired, Gabe. Get out of my sight before I have security throw you out with the rest of the trash." Gabriel stood up slowly, the silence in the ballroom becoming so heavy it felt as if the air had left the room. He didn't look at the exit. Instead, his eyes moved toward the executive elevator bank, and then back to Forde. He didn't speak a word of defense. He simply reached into the pocket of his coveralls, his fingers brushing against the master keycard that opened every door in the building. Beside the stage, Marcus Holloway caught Gabriel's eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The war hadn't just started, it was already over. Harrison Forde did not stop at a simple dismissal, he sensed the scent of blood and the glow of the spotlight, and he intended to feast. He signaled to the hovering press corps, beckoning the cameras closer until the red tally lights circled Gabriel like the eyes of scavengers. "You see this?" Forde barked, his voice amplified by the lapel mic that carried his disdain to every corner of the ballroom. "This is the rot I've been talking about. The dead weight that drags down an empire." He stepped onto the first tier of the stage, looking down at Gabriel with a smirk that felt like a physical blow. The crowd of socialites held their breath, their faces a blur of curiosity and discomfort, but Forde was oblivious to their unease. To him, this was the ultimate brand-building exercise. For years, Stone Global was a charity disguised as a corporation, he continued, gesturing widely at the room. "We coddled the Gabes of the world. We gave them breaks, we gave them benefits, and in return, they gave us mediocrity. But that ends tonight." Forde reached out and snatched a half-empty glass of champagne from a passing tray, holding it high like a trophy. "Efficiency is a fire, and tonight, I am weeding out the weak. If you can't keep pace with the predators, you don't deserve a seat at the table or even a spot on the floor." He turned back to Gabriel, his eyes narrow and cruel. "You aren't just fired from this building. I'm blacklisting you from the industry. By tomorrow morning, your name will be synonymous with the kind of laziness that Stone Global no longer tolerates. Now, pick up your bucket and crawl out the service entrance. You're polluting the view." A ripple of laughter, thin and nervous, escaped from a few of the younger executives, but the rest of the room remained deathly silent. Gabriel didn't look at the cameras, and he didn't look at the sneering man on the stage. He simply adjusted the battered cap on his head and took a final, sweeping look at the faces of his employees standing in the wings, the waiters, the cleaners, the guards. He saw the fear in their eyes, and beneath it, a spark of shared resentment. In the back of the room, Marcus Holloway tapped a command into his tablet, his face illuminated by the blue light of the screen. He looked up, his smirk widening as he met Gabriel's calm gaze one last time. Forde was still talking, spinning a fantasy of his own greatness to the rolling cameras, completely unaware that he had just broadcast his own deposition to the world. Gabriel turned without a word, his heavy boots thudding softly on the red carpet as he walked away, not toward the service entrance, but toward the private elevator bank that led only to the top. Gabriel turned his back on the cameras and the cacophony of Forde's ego, moving with a deliberate, haunting stillness. To the onlookers, it looked like the slumped retreat of a defeated man, a ghost in blue denim fading into the shadows of the velvet curtains. Forde let out a final, mocking peal of laughter that bounced off the high ceilings, already turning back to the mahogany desk to claim his prize. He didn't see Gabriel bypass the service hallway. He didn't notice that the janitor wasn't heading for the street where the cold rain waited, but toward the reinforced steel doors of the private executive bank. The security guard stationed at the restricted lift began to step forward, his hand moving toward his radio to intercept the intruder. But as Gabriel reached the sensor, he didn't fumble or hesitate. He pulled a matte black keycard from the hidden pocket of his coveralls, the master key that had been dormant for months. The light on the panel didn't turn red, it flashed a deep, respectful blue. The guard froze, his eyes widening as the heavy doors slid open with a hiss of pressurized air. He looked from the card to the man in the grease-stained cap, catching a glimpse of the steel in Gabriel's gaze. The guard slowly stepped back, snapping into a sharp, instinctive salute that Gabriel acknowledged with a single, weary nod. Inside the elevator, the noise of the gala died instantly, replaced by the soft, rhythmic hum of a machine built for the gods of industry. Gabriel reached up and pulled the battered cap from his head, tossing it into the corner. He unzipped the blue coveralls, stepping out of the sweat-soaked fabric to reveal the tailored charcoal trousers and the crisp white shirt he had worn beneath his disguise. He wasn't Gabe the janitor anymore. The air in the rising cabin seemed to thicken with his returning authority. As the digital floor counter climbed toward the penthouse, the inner sanctum that Forde believed was his alone, Gabriel checked his watch. Below him, the pressure in the boiler room was nearing the red line, and the pressure in the ballroom was about to explode in a different way. He looked at his reflection in the polished chrome of the elevator doors. The smudge of grease remained on his cheek, a war paint of the ground floor he was about to avenge. The elevator chimed, a low, melodic tone that signaled his arrival at the summit of Stone Global. The doors opened to a silent, darkened corridor of oak and glass. Gabriel stepped out, his heavy boots sounding like a funeral march against the hardwood. He walked past the secretarial desks and the trophy cases of his father's achievements, heading straight for the massive, double-oaked doors of the owner's suite. He went inside, moved across the darkened room, and sat in the high-back leather chair that had been empty for far too long. He didn't turn on the lights. He simply waited for Harrison Forde to come up and meet his maker. The celebration spilled from the elevator like a flood of unearned victory. Harrison Forde led the way, his chest puffed out, flanked by three of his closest allies and a photographer eager to capture the final stroke of the pen. They moved through the darkened outer office, their boisterous laughter echoing off the glass walls. Forde was still riding the adrenaline of the gala, his voice loud and raspy from the thrill of the kill. "Did you see his face?" Forde chuckled, tossing his tuxedo jacket onto a side table. "That pathetic Gabe. He actually thought he could just sit there and rot in my building. Firing him was more satisfying than the merger itself." One of the executives laughed, pouring a round of century-old cognac from the sideboard. "You made an example of him, Harrison. The staff won't be taking breaks for a long, long time." Forde grabbed a glass, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "That's the secret to leadership. You have to remind the cattle who owns the pasture. Now, let's sign these papers and bury the old Stone Global for good." They reached the massive, double-oaked doors of the owner's suite. Forde didn't knock, he shoved them open with the arrogance of a man who believed the world had finally bowed to his will. The suite was cast in deep shadows, illuminated only by the cold, blue light of the Manhattan skyline bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The air in the room was eerily still, smelling of old leather and the faint, sharp scent of ozone. "What is it with the lights in this place?" Forde muttered, fumbling for the switch. "I told the maintenance crew." He stopped mid-sentence. The lights flickered on, revealing the massive mahogany desk at the far end of the room. The high-backed leather chair was turned away from them, facing the window. Forde's smile faltered, replaced by a sudden, sharp prickle of unease. He set his glass down on a side table, his hand trembling slightly. "Who's in here? Marcus? Is that you?" There was no answer, only the low, rhythmic hum of the building's ventilation. Forde stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking nervously against the hardwood. "The party is downstairs, whoever you are. This is a private office. I suggest you leave before I..." The chair began to rotate. It moved slowly, with a heavy, deliberate grace. As it turned, the figure sitting in it came into focus. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo, nor was he draped in the blue denim of a servant. He sat in a crisp white shirt, his charcoal trousers perfectly pressed, his hands folded calmly over a folder of engineering reports. Forde's breath hitched in his throat. He recognized the jawline. He recognized the eyes, those cold, clinical eyes that had watched him from the floor of the gala. But the janitor was no longer looking up. He was looking down. "You're late, Harrison," Gabriel Stone said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards. "And you're still wearing your shoes in my office." The silence in the room became a vacuum, swallowing the sound of Harrison Forde's shallow, panicked breathing. He stared at the man in the chair, his mind struggling to reconcile the lazy janitor he had just humiliated with the figure now radiating a quiet, absolute authority. The grease smudge on Gabriel's cheek no longer looked like dirt, it looked like the remains of a mask that had served its purpose. "Gabe?" Forde's voice was a pathetic whisper, the arrogant boom of the gala replaced by a tremulous uncertainty. What is this? Why are you in Mr. Stone's chair?" Gabriel didn't answer immediately. He leaned forward into the light, picked up the fountain pen Forde had held aloft like a scepter downstairs, and tapped it against the multi-billion-dollar merger agreement. "You spent the last hour telling the world that I was dead weight, Harrison. You told them I was a stain on the marble." He looked at the executives frozen in the doorway, their cognac glasses trembling. But the problem with looking down at people is that you never notice who is actually holding the floor up. Gabriel slid the merger documents across the desk toward Forde. They weren't signed. Instead, a thick red line had been drawn through the signature block. "I've spent the last month as Gabe," Gabriel continued, his voice steady and cold. "I've seen the way you treat the people who build this company. I've seen the safety bypasses you installed to save a few dollars for your bonus. And I've seen that you don't even know the face of the man who hired you." Forde's face went from pale to a sickly, mottled gray. He looked at the documents, then back at the man he had just fired in front of thousands of people. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Gabriel Stone hadn't been taking a break, he had been conducting the final audit of Forde's soul. "You wanted to eat out the week tonight, Harrison," Gabriel said, standing up slowly. Even without the platform of the gala stage, he seemed to tower over the room. "You were right about one thing. It is time to clean house." In the doorway, Marcus Holloway appeared, his smirk now a full, grim smile as he held up a digital tablet displaying the evidence of Forde's criminal negligence. The trap hadn't just closed. It had disappeared, leaving Forde standing on nothing but the wreckage of his own arrogance. Gabriel gestured to the door. "You're not signing this merger, Harrison. You're signing a confession." The heavy silence of the suite was broken by the sharp, rhythmic tap of Marcus Holloway's shoes on the hardwood. He stepped into the light, placing a translucent digital tablet on the mahogany surface between Gabriel and the trembling CEO. The screen glowed with the cold, irrefutable blue of high-resolution schematics and highlighted red text. "The audit is complete, Mr. Stone," Marcus said, his voice as clinical as a surgeon's. He swiped across the screen, revealing a series of time-stamped photos of the bypass clamp in the basement, followed by a scanned document bearing Harrison Forde's signature. 17 safety violations. 3 counts of fraudulent reporting to the board. And the most damning piece, the deliberate denial of repairs for the primary boiler system just to inflate the merger valuation. Harrison Forde stared at his own signature on the screen, the ink looking like a death warrant. He tried to speak, but his throat had turned to ash. The executives behind him began to back away, literally distancing themselves from a man whose career was disintegrating in real time. Gabriel leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. The grease on his knuckles and the charcoal of his expensive trousers met at the edge of the light, a fusion of the worker and the owner. "You told me downstairs that you weed out the weak, Harrison. You said that Stone Global has no room for deadweight or people who don't move like predators." Gabriel picked up the termination papers Marcus had prepared. They weren't the standard corporate documents, they were a mirror of everything Forde had said at the gala. "I took your advice," Gabriel continued, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "I'm cleaning house. And it turns out, the biggest piece of trash in this building isn't sitting in a folding chair behind a curtain. It's standing right here, wearing a $10,000 tuxedo." He slid the papers across the desk. "You're fired, Harrison. And as you said so eloquently to the press, you're blacklisted. Not because of your laziness, but because of your incompetence. You mistook oversight for passivity, and you mistook a uniform for a lack of intelligence." Forde's hands shook so violently he could barely hold the document. He looked up, his eyes pleading, searching for a spark of the Gabe he thought he could bully. But the man in front of him was stone, unyielding and absolute. "Marcus," Gabriel said, never taking his eyes off Forde. "Escort the former CEO to the service entrance. Make sure he takes his trash with him. And tell security he's never to be allowed back on the marble." Harrison Forde was let out in a daze, his footsteps heavy and hollow, while Gabriel remained in the chair. The janitor had finally finished the job, and for the first time in a year, the air in Stone Global felt clean. Gabriel Stone stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the owner's suite, watching the first light of dawn bleed across the New York skyline. The gala was over, the police had escorted Harrison Forde from the premises for reckless endangerment, and the adrenaline that had fueled Gabriel's undercover mission was finally settling into a cold, clear resolve. He looked down at his hands, they were clean now, but the memory of the grease and the weight of the mop remained etched in his muscles. He turned to Marcus, who was busy drafting a company-wide memorandum. "Cancel the merger, Marcus," Gabriel said, his voice quiet but echoing with an authority that didn't need to be shouted. "We don't need to be a weapon. We need to be a foundation." By 8 a.m., every screen in Stone Global, from the tablets in the executive wing to the time clock monitors in the loading docks, flickered to life with a live feed from the boardroom. Gabriel sat at the head of the table, still wearing the simple white shirt from the night before, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He didn't look like a distant billionaire, he looked like a man who had been in the trenches. "My name is Gabriel Stone," he began, and a hush fell over the 40-story tower. "For the past month, many of you knew me as Gabe. I cleaned your offices, I emptied your trash, and I sat in your break rooms. I did this because I wanted to see the truth of the company my father built." He paused, meeting the camera with an unblinking gaze. "What I found was that we became a company that priced profits over people and optics over safety. We allowed the people who keep this building standing to become invisible." He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the mahogany table. "That ends today. Effective immediately, the maintenance and service budgets are being tripled. We are fixing every valve, every boiler, and every light. But more importantly, we are changing how we see each other." Gabriel announced a radical restructuring, a significant pay increase for all ground floor staff, a direct-to-owner reporting line for safety concerns, and the permanent removal of the executive-only elevators. "From this moment on, no worker at Stone Global is invisible," Gabriel declared. "The man with the mop is just as vital to our success as the man with the pen. If you cannot lead with respect for every person in this building, you have no place on the top floor." As he ended the feed, a sound began to rise through the vents, a distant, rolling thunder of applause from 30 floors below. Gabriel leaned back in his chair, finally closing his eyes. The janitor had finished his final shift, and for the first time in a generation, the heart of Stone Global was beating with a steady, honest rhythm.